Hi, I'm Clyde Haberman of the New York Times, filling in for Sam Roberts. This was a big week of power and politics. We had bombshell testimony at the January 6th hearings describing an out-of-control President Trump. And Tuesday's primary election here gave us some clues as to what New Yorkers are most concerned about. Joining me to discuss this and more are New York Times Metro reporter Jeffery and national correspondent Katie Glueck. Welcome, both of you. I began last week's show by asking Luke Broadwater in Washington, and it's a question I'm going to have to ask again in light of Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony. How are these hearings affecting the likelihood of Donald Trump being indicted at some point?
Certainly we are seeing that people around the president knew very clearly that there was a risk of illegal activity underway, or at least activity that could be seen as criminal, and there were warnings about that. At the same time, we don't know, of course, what prosecutors may do, but the more the hearings go on, and the more that we see additional people very close to the president being subpoenaed, as we may well see next week, certainly the more attention and the more this comes into the spotlight.
Any thoughts on this?
I don't know. There's already been 2 impeachments. I'm not sure what effect this would have on the electorate. I mean, it seems that his voters are his voters, and
that was going to be my next question. Does this move the needle at all?
Yeah, I just don't see it. I mean, I think people are just unconvinced about the 2 impeachments to begin with. If he's indicted but not convicted, I'm not sure that's going to change any hearts and minds heading into the midterms and also the presidential 24.
Is that your sense too?
We have not seen a lot of evidence that focus on this particular issue, at least up till now, is really moving the dial, at least with swing voters. Polls show overwhelmingly that the top concern for voters has been concerns around inflation, the economy.
Sure.
We are seeing now a lot of questions around the degree to which abortion may end up moving the dial. However, Democrats do see the hearings and the revelations from them as part of a broader message that the Republican Party has moved into such an extreme position that their hope is that even some folks who maybe they voted for Biden at the top of the ticket but went Republican down ballot in 2020, which is something that happened, perhaps at least some of those folks may think twice about voting Republican again as part of this broader extremism argument.
I asked the question because I'm just wondering how many Cassidy Hutchinsons there are out there in the electorate of people who, and she's clearly a Republican. She went to work for that White House, Deputy Chief of Staff. How many Ms. Hutchinsons are out there saying, enough, this is, our democracy's on the line? So, I mean, I'm not asking you necessarily to have a firm answer on it, but there's got to be more than a handful of people, I would think, who say, okay, he embodies a lot of my political views, but the guy's a criminal.
I mean, I think it remains to be seen, like Katie said. But I know in New York, for example, where Governor Kathy Hochul just won the Democratic primary and Lee Zeldin just won the Republican primary, the next day she had an ad out branding him as an extremist.
Right.
And that's clearly going to be her strategy throughout this election, is to paint him as the extremist, to paint herself as the sort of moderate voice of reason for the state and where the country should be headed.
I was going to turn to New York politics a little bit later, but now that you've mentioned that, does Lee Zeldin stand a chance? I mean, we have not had a Republican elected to statewide office since 2002, George Pataki, and he's the only one since 1994. So it's practically 30 years of wandering in the wilderness for that party in New York. Have things changed?
I mean, I think it's difficult in New York where Democrats just outnumber Republicans numerically, first of all. Second of all, look at where the issues are right now. Governor Hochul is talking a lot about abortion and what she's doing to sort of preserve abortion rights here in New York. Also, guns is another issue where she's both tried to paint Mr. Zeldin as really extreme. If you remember, Governor Pataki was a pro-choice governor as well. So that's going to be a difference with Zeldin, Mr. Zeldin running on those positions that are, really further to the right than a good group of New Yorkers.
Katie?
Definitely agree with Jeff that it would be incredibly difficult for any Republican to win statewide in New York. Congressman Zeldin has taken a number of positions, as Jeff noted, including as related to the election.
How would a Republican win? What would Zeldin have to do, do you think?
Well, what I was going to add there is, even though he has taken a lot of very conservative positions that may well be pretty disqualifying, in the eyes of a lot of the electorate, this is a very difficult moment for the Democrats nationally. And so, certainly the Republican bet is that with so many voters so upset about cost of living, inflation, gas prices. On Long Island, we've seen over the last year a lot of concerns about crime, and that's resulted in some unexpected election results on Long Island. Typically, fairly, at least in recent years, more Democratic territory. We saw a number of local seats flip last fall. So the Republican hope is that in such a difficult environment for Democrats, they may be able to make inroads even in very blue states. But as Jeff noted, it's going to be very difficult in New York.
Even though the last time I looked, the governor of New York or any state can't set gas prices.
Indeed, but
okay, I'm being overly rational here.
But they can link Governor Hochul to President Biden.
Sure.
And his very dismal approval ratings on issues like inflation.
And of course, his allies would note he doesn't set gas prices either, but there is so much frustration at the party in power.
No, fair enough. And that's usually the incumbent party suffers in that regard. Turning to the Supreme Court, which has been on a heck of a roll these last 10 days or so, does overturning Roe v. Wade clearly help Democrats? Not so much. I know we're still almost 4 months away from Election Day, but if you are a Democratic policy and campaign planner, would you be in some way happy about this decision in terms of this may help my candidates?
So the party strategists and elected officials I've been speaking to about this.
And I wanted to add, you've been reporting from Michigan and Pennsylvania, I believe, on this. So what are you finding?
Indeed, in two states where who the next governor is may well decide essentially the existence of abortion rights in many circumstances in those two major industrial swing states. But I think a lot of party strategists and elected officials on both sides of the aisle do not believe that even something as seismic as overturning Roe versus Wade transforms the political environment. There are still, as we were just discussing, a lot of problems for the party in power. That said, you can see evidence that this is breaking through with some voters in some key House districts, and certainly voters who may well make the difference in a number of statewide contests in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And a lot of these voters tend to be the moderate suburbanites who couldn't stand Donald Trump. They don't like Joe Biden very much either, but they do see the Republicans as going too far on some of these really personal, in their view, kind of cultural issues, especially around abortion.
Sure. Jeff, pragmatically, is there more that New York State can or even will do on abortion rights, or are they so entrenched in a state like ours that there's really only tinkering around the edges, if that?
Well, Governor Hochul has called the legislature back for the special session to make changes to the gun law based on the Supreme Court ruling, which overturned the sort of concealed carry restrictions that New York had in place. She's also said she wouldn't mind if they took a look at sort of this equality amendment, which would sort of enshrine some broader protections into the state law as well. So I think and this has been Congressman Zeldin's point, is that a lot of the protections for abortion are already in place in New York, and there's not much that could happen on that. But I believe she is trying to push that even further. That idea that even more protection should be enshrined into state law.
I mentioned at the top that the legislature is meeting on gun laws on Thursday, and we're taping on Thursday, so we don't have a clear sense of what they're going to do. But do we have some sense of what they may do to circumnavigate, if you will, the Supreme Court ruling? Better training requirements, for example, maybe age limits on how you can buy a gun. How close to the edge of running afoul of the Supreme Court can they dance?
Well, I think one of the biggest things is they're going to try to create sensitive areas where, carrying a concealed weapon is not allowed. And that was kind of in line with the ruling with, what would be permissible. And so that's going to come out. I think the issue there is, in private businesses, for example, the governor has said she wants them to have to opt out of or opt into allowing people to carry concealed weapons. I think that's an area where gun rights individuals feel like there may be room to challenge that. But in some of the other areas, the increased training, for example, have to have your gun locked up if you have anyone in the house 18 or older, that would increase that from age 16 to age 18 as well. Those protections seem like they're pretty safe. I think the one question is going to be the sort of sensitive areas designation.
As to what qualifies as a sensitive area. But isn't the whole concept of saying some areas are too sensitive for guns means guns don't belong in our society to the degree that they have? You're out and about on this, lady. It just strikes me as these exceptions, while fine, strikes me as tacit acknowledgement of we've got a problem that clearly the U.S. Supreme Court is not acknowledging.
We're in a really interesting moment because for a long time, voters have not often prioritized abortion rights and gun control for folks who do want to see
they
some more
seem
control.
Settled.
Sure, exactly. And so this is a really interesting moment because suddenly, in the eyes of a lot of voters, perhaps things are not so settled. And I will tell you, I've spent quite a bit of time over the last week in some of these more suburban swing areas, like Grand Rapids and in suburban Philadelphia. And the thing I keep hearing from some of these more moderate swing voters, to the extent they still exist, and at least some do, is they're very concerned about abortion rights, and they are very concerned about gun violence, especially after the massacre in Texas. And of course, some Republicans seem to be cognizant of that, at least to some degree, because for the first time in quite a while,
they passed something.
They did, and not anywhere near as far-reaching as a lot of Democrats had hoped, but something which seemed to indicate some recognition that this is a salient issue for a lot of voters. And then back to the abortion rights question for a moment, we'll notice that as much as there's plenty of Republicans at the state level who are very eager to talk about just how far they can go in promoting restrictions, which is something that is very meaningful to many conservatives, nationally we are seeing plenty of Republican leaders who would rather not talk about this issue. They do want to keep bringing the focus back to cost of living, inflation, the president. Right. So that does seem to signal that they detect at least some degree of political risk here.
We had a story in Thursday's paper which surprised me that I hadn't thought of it, about restrictions that some states may put on a state like New York soliciting soliciting its availability for abortions. I did not think that was permissible. It sounds like a free speech issue. But can we have abortion restrictions that are going to go even further than the Supreme Court just imposed, in which you cannot even advocate it from afar? This seems on the agenda.
I still think those questions are going to have to be decided, right? For example, can New York be prevented from having people come in for services here? The governor has said New York is going to be a safe harbor. So, what protections actually exist? Plan B and other sort of abortion-inducing drugs. What's going to be the availability of those drugs to people in those states where abortion has been restricted? So I think there's just a bunch of questions that have yet to be resolved, and maybe we'll see winding their way through the courts.
Clearly on this. Jeff, you had a piece this week which was about a judge who tossed out New York's wanting to have non-citizens vote, at least in municipal elections, not in national elections for sure. And that affects about 800,000 people in our, is it just the city or the state? City.
City.
And indeed, municipal elections. And, but what's the practical effect of that? I mean, hard for me to believe that all of those, or even many of those 800,000 would vote, in fact. Our turnout has been pretty abysmal, as we saw again this week in the governor's race.
Right. I mean, well, this has been a push by immigrants' rights advocates for decades now, is to have, people who live here who are legally permanent residents who pay taxes, to be able to have them have a say in local government, who their mayor is, who their council person is. They often make decisions that affect your life in ways that are very specific. So in overturning that, the judge said that the Constitution limits it to citizens, which is the argument against that. And
Right.
it doesn't specifically say only citizens. So I think the appeal is going to focus on that language in the Constitution and whether it limits citizens. But around the country, you've seen places who are going back, changing it to make it explicit that only citizens can vote.
Well, it's sort of like, you're not a member of the club. You want to vote for president of the club, join the club, but they will appeal. This is the ruling.
Yes, the folks who've filed or will appeal this ruling, absolutely.
Do you have a sense, I bet you've been focusing on this, we have two long-term incumbents in Congress, Jerry Nadler and Carolyn Maloney, are now about to go head-to-head. And so far it's been relatively civil. I doubt that's going to last forever. I mean, how ugly is this one going to get? Any sense?
Yeah, I think we're already starting to see implicitly some, from both sides, some jabs, and I think it's going to get quite a bit more explicit as we get a little bit closer to August. These are two veteran lawmakers. Both of them, make some claims to some claims at least to history, and I think both of them feel very strongly that they have a strong claim to the newly redrawn district.
You're going to cover that, I suspect.
Yeah, maybe, absolutely. I think, there's also the other argument. This is a loss for the city, where you have two
For sure.
long-term legislators, and one of them is going to be gone, and you're going to lose that experience in Congress.
Oof, we have less than a minute, so very quickly, does Andrew Giuliani have a future? He ran second in the Republican primary, and he's not held what I would consider a real job ever. Are we finished with him, or there's more to come, you figure?
I imagine that he or folks around him will certainly see an opportunity for a new platform here.
Yeah, I think he's young enough that he can come back, but unlike someone like Lee Zeldin, he's definitely much more further to the right and has not been able to hide that at all.
If you got any further to the right, he'd be off the charts. There's no question about it. Thank you both. Thank you, Jeffrey Mays and Katie Glueck. Up next, the man whose job it is to get guns off the streets of New York. Last week, the Supreme Court called New York's concealed carry gun laws unconstitutional. Doesn't change the law. That's up to state lawmakers in Albany. So the governor called a special session on Thursday to get new, tighter gun legislation put back on the books in some fashion. Here in the city, there are still so many guns on the streets. The NYPD released numbers that show the murder rate may be down compared to last year, but robbery is up 40%. In June, Mayor Adams named André Mitchell, A.T. Mitchell, as co-chair of the Gun Violence Protection Task Force. Welcome, Mr. Mitchell. The Supreme Court has struck down New York's relatively strict gun law by a 6-3 vote. I don't think there are too many people cheering at City Hall about this. Can we gauge the immediate impact of this ruling on our city and cities in general?
Yes, I can assure you that it's not something that's being cheered not only in City Hall but in urban neighborhoods throughout, the country. It's a very scary ruling. It's unfortunate that we are now going to have to wonder and worry more so about folks that are carrying and the use of guns in the hands of people who may not be mentally stable in order to really feel safe. And so it's a very scary time.
Yeah, fair enough. What has gone wrong on our streets in terms of gun violence? I know that the pandemic is blamed by many people. Poverty is blamed. But I guess there's a part of me that sort of comes out of the gang song in West Side Story, in which they say mockingly, "We're depraved on account of we're deprived." To what degree is it indeed a social phenomenon? To what degree is it the police perhaps not being as vigorous in doing their job in getting guns off the street. Is there just a sense out there that you can get away with mayhem?
I wouldn't think so. I think that this sense of fear is that it's still just bad people, they have access to these bad weapons and they're using it. But it's still, we can't overrule or negate those things that you mentioned before. The fact that we are coming out of a pandemic, unlike ever in the history of our time. We can't not just, underrule the poverty, the issues of unemployment and things of that nature that gives feed to crimes, happening. And so I think it's a combination of a number of different things. In our communities, the glorification of weaponry is something that's marketed and it's promoted. And then if these things are made accessible, due to the proliferation of guns making their way into those neighborhoods, you're going to see things that we are experiencing today.
The very discomforting reality in New York is that 90% of the murders are committed by blacks and Latinos. Just as discomforting is the fact that more than 90% of the victims are black and Latino. And this has been true for years now. This is not a new phenomenon. How has this pattern defied solution for so long?
Well, we've been losing, as you just mentioned, on both sides of the aisle, right? It's on one half of it, it's a public health crisis.
Yeah.
We're losing our young people due to the epidemic of gun violence or the disease of gun violence. And we're using our other young people due to the criminal justice system because the perpetrators, unfortunately, lives are going to never be the same once they are apprehended. But in the middle of that, there are the overwhelming majority of the people in the community are good people. They're law-abiding people. We're talking about a very small microcosm or minority of folks.
But we've learned that it doesn't take very many people to create at least a sense of chaos, if not.
No, it doesn't. Absolutely. But I believe in the power of people. I believe that the majority, there's more of us than it is of them. And if we really was to work collectively as a community, as a society, we can approach that and find out exactly how do we are able to either service that population, or do whatever the law says it has to be done. But I believe that we can reach them and be able to provide some meaningful services.
How much of the problem is the so-called iron pipeline from the South of guns just flooding our streets?
I think it's a major part of it. I think that's also where we need to focus some of our attention. I believe if we focus our attention with law enforcement on the iron pipeline, on the harbors and so forth, the highways and the byways, I say, and really stop the influx of the guns from making their way in. We always have to remember that these guns are not manufactured in those neighborhoods. And how so many guns make their way in is unbeknownst to a lot of us.
How will your task force work? How will, and do you have a time limit on when you're supposed to come up with recommendations? And obviously you have work ahead of you, but do you have a sense already that you can share with us of kind of recommendations you think you might be heading toward?
Well, right now we are really pulling the task force together, the Mayor signed this executive order, which really gives us the opportunity to ask all of the high-level government officials to participate. I think that's something that's unprecedented, to really see this as an all-hands-on-deck approach. We are looking to begin our meetings as soon as next week. We really want to get something done and listen to all the strong recommendations and produce a plan of action by midsummer, and so that we could really feel confident that we have something in effect during this summer of 2022.
And I gather the mayor is quite focused on this. Obviously,
very much.
If he doesn't get crime down, just politically, he's going to be.
I mean, it's
trouble.
a huge overtaking. He came into this. I think people have to remember he's only 6 months in, and so a lot of what we've been experiencing is something that he inherited coming into office.
Sure.
And so we need to give more time, for all of these mechanisms and parts to play its part. You know, we didn't wind up in this predicament overnight. And so I know, although we really would expect and want an immediate solution, we have to be more realistic. You know, it's going to take us some time to turn the tides. It's just like turning a cruise liner around.
Right.
You know, but as long as we see that we're headed in the right direction, as you know, we want to see, of course, the trend go down and begin to start seeing less people shot and less people killed. I think we will be on the right track.
Well, on the plus side, at least as of the other day, murders are down so far this year compared to last year, but
Yes.
but they're still much higher than they were 2-3 years ago.
Yes.
So there's a way to go. And do you go into other areas of crime too, or are we focus mainly on guns and violence?
Well, right now, the priority is to stop the bleeding. And we're looking at really, we know we have
Right.
to stop the bleeding. And we are prioritizing the gun violence that is taking place. And we are focusing basically in 30 different precincts in the city based on data. So we're doing precision prevention. That's our idea, is how do we get to the crime before it actually happens.
Fair enough. André Mitchell, thank you for joining us. For CUNY TV, I'm Clyde Haberman.